There is a certain emotional confusion that feels like a storm you can't predict. One moment, everything feels intense, close, and meaningful, and the next moment, distance appears without warning. Not a slow fading, but a sudden withdrawal that leaves you questioning what just happened. This pattern is not random. It follows a psychological rhythm that many people experience in relationships where emotional closeness triggers fear instead of comfort. The push and pull dynamic is not about your worth. It is about emotional wiring, fear responses, and the struggle between desire and self-protection. What you are about to understand will not only explain the behavior, it will also give you clarity about what to do when love feels inconsistent, confusing, and emotionally unstable. At the beginning of this kind of connection, everything feels unusually intense, almost like the emotional world has suddenly accelerated beyond normal limits. There is a strong sense of being chosen, seen, and emotionally awakened in a way that feels rare and deeply meaningful. The conversations flow with ease, attention feels focused, and there is a magnetic pull that makes both people feel unusually connected in a short amount of time. It doesn't feel gradual or slow. It feels immediate, like something important has just entered your life and changed your emotional state. This early stage is often fueled by emotional novelty. When someone has a tendency to fluctuate between closeness and distance, the moments of connection can feel especially powerful because they are not constant. The inconsistency itself creates heightened emotional sensitivity, so when attention is given, it feels amplified. Small gestures feel bigger than they normally would. A simple message can feel loaded with meaning. A moment of closeness can feel like emotional proof that something real is developing. But what is often not seen in this stage is the psychological contrast happening beneath the surface. Emotional intensity is not always the same as emotional stability. At the beginning, there is usually no real emotional pressure yet. No deep expectations, no sustained vulnerability demands, and no long-term emotional responsibility being fully activated. This creates a space where connection feels light, exciting, and emotionally rewarding without requiring the full weight of deeper emotional commitment. In this phase, closeness feels safe because it is still flexible. There is room to engage without feeling trapped. There is excitement without emotional burden. That combination creates a powerful illusion of compatibility. It feels like two emotional worlds aligning effortlessly, but in reality, it is often the absence of pressure that is allowing the connection to feel so smooth. Another important aspect of this early magnetism is emotional projection. When someone experiences inconsistency in closeness and distance patterns, the mind naturally fills in the gaps. The emotional imagination starts to build meaning from limited information. You begin to interpret consistency in moments rather than patterns. You remember the warmth more than the absence. You focus on the emotional highs and minimize the neutral or uncertain signals. This creates an emotional amplification effect. The connection doesn't just feel good, it feels significant. It starts to carry emotional weight that may not yet be fully grounded in consistent behavior. And because the emotional experience feels so strong, it becomes easy to assume that intensity equals depth. But intensity in early stages is often more about emotional activation than emotional foundation. There is also an internal sense of emotional awakening that can occur during this stage. When someone gives focused attention after emotional distance or uncertainty, it can feel like relief. The nervous system responds strongly to that relief. It registers closeness as something rewarding, almost like a reward after uncertainty. This creates a cycle where emotional availability feels more powerful than it actually is, because it contrasts with previous emotional unpredictability. And in that contrast, attachment begins to form quickly. Not always consciously, but emotionally. The connection starts to occupy mental space. It becomes something you think about more than you realize. You start anticipating interaction, replaying conversations, and reading deeper meaning into small moments of connection. But beneath all of this emotional momentum, there is still a missing layer: consistency over time. At this stage, the connection is being built on emotional peaks rather than emotional steadiness. It is being experienced in moments rather than sustained presence. And that is why it feels so strong so quickly. It is not slowed down by the reality of long-term emotional rhythm. This is the foundation of the pull. It is not just attraction. It is emotional activation combined with unpredictability, novelty, and heightened meaning. It feels like something rare is happening, and that feeling alone can be powerful enough to draw someone deeply into the connection before they fully realize the emotional pattern they are entering. As the connection begins to deepen, something subtle but powerful starts to shift beneath the surface. What once felt exciting, light, and emotionally effortless slowly begins to feel heavier internally. The same closeness that once created joy starts to create internal pressure. It is not that the bond suddenly becomes wrong or unwanted. It is that emotional exposure begins to activate deeper internal responses that were not visible in the beginning. When emotional intimacy increases, the sense of being seen more fully also increases. This is where vulnerability becomes unavoidable. At first, emotional sharing feels manageable because it is selective. People reveal parts of themselves while still maintaining emotional distance. But as consistency builds and expectations form, even unspoken ones, the emotional system starts to perceive closeness differently. What once felt like connection begins to feel like exposure. This is where an internal conflict quietly emerges. On one side, there is desire for connection, affection, and emotional closeness. On the other side, there is a growing discomfort that arises when emotional dependency starts to feel possible. It is not always logical or conscious. It is a deeply conditioned response rooted in how emotional safety has been learned over time. When closeness starts to feel like it could lead to emotional loss of control, the nervous system begins to react. Instead of experiencing deeper intimacy as comfort, it is interpreted as pressure. The expectation, whether spoken or unspoken, to stay emotionally available, consistent, or deeply engaged can start to feel overwhelming. Not because the connection is harmful, but because emotional intensity is no longer temporary. It is becoming sustained, and sustained emotional intensity requires a level of vulnerability that feels risky to someone who associates closeness with emotional unpredictability. This is where fear begins to influence behavior more than desire. The emotional system starts scanning for escape routes, not because love is absent, but because emotional safety feels threatened. The closeness that once felt exciting now begins to feel like something that requires energy to maintain, something that demands emotional presence on a deeper level than what feels manageable in that moment. As this internal discomfort grows, emotional withdrawal begins forming as a protective response. It often does not appear suddenly in a dramatic way. Instead, it begins subtly. Delayed responses, reduced emotional engagement, less expressive communication, or a slight shift in tone. These are not always conscious decisions to disconnect. They are often unconscious attempts to reduce emotional intensity and regain internal balance. What makes this stage so confusing is that it does not erase the emotional connection. The feelings are still there, but they become conflicted. There is still care, still attraction, still emotional attachment, but it is now mixed with a need for space. This internal contradiction creates inconsistency in behavior. One moment there is warmth, the next moment there is distance. One moment there is openness, the next moment there is emotional withdrawal. From the outside, this shift can feel sudden and confusing, but internally, it is experienced as regulation. Distance begins to feel like relief. Space becomes a way to calm emotional overstimulation. Silence becomes a way to regain a sense of control over internal emotional intensity. The nervous system, overwhelmed by sustained closeness, seeks reduction, not rejection, but regulation. The key misunderstanding in this stage is assuming that emotional withdrawal equals loss of interest. In reality, the emotional system is not always rejecting the connection itself. It is rejecting the feeling of emotional overwhelm that comes with sustained closeness. The desire for connection and the need for space begin to exist simultaneously, creating an internal push and pull that reflects itself in external behavior. This is where fear becomes louder than emotional desire. Not because love is absent, but because emotional capacity feels strained. The system chooses distance not to end the bond but to reduce internal pressure. And in doing so, it creates confusion for the other person, who experiences the withdrawal as emotional inconsistency rather than emotional regulation. This internal fear of emotional exposure is the turning point where connection starts shifting from expansion to fluctuation. When emotional closeness reaches a level that begins to feel overwhelming internally, the response is not always a clear conversation or a conscious decision. Instead, it often manifests as withdrawal, a gradual or sometimes sudden step back that is designed to reduce emotional intensity. From the outside, it can feel confusing, even painful, because it appears as though the connection has changed direction without warning. But internally, this shift is less about rejection and more about regulation. At this stage, the nervous system is no longer experiencing closeness as purely rewarding. It begins to experience it as emotionally demanding. Even simple interactions can start to feel like they carry emotional weight. A message is no longer just a message. It feels like a request for presence. A conversation is no longer just connection. It feels like emotional engagement that requires energy and availability. Over time, this builds an internal sense of pressure that becomes difficult to maintain consistently. When that internal pressure crosses a certain threshold, withdrawal begins to form as a protective mechanism. It is not always planned or intentional. It is often an automatic response designed to restore emotional equilibrium. Distance creates space, and space creates relief. That relief is not emotional rejection, it is emotional decompression. The system is trying to return to a state where it feels in control again, where emotions are not constantly activated by closeness. This is why the push away can feel so sudden to the other person. From their perspective, everything may have been progressing or deepening, while internally, the experience was becoming increasingly intense and difficult to manage. The external behavior does not always reflect the internal emotional state until the pressure becomes too high to sustain. Once withdrawal begins, there is often a noticeable change in emotional availability. Communication may become less frequent or less expressive. Responses may feel shorter or more delayed. Emotional warmth that once felt consistent may now appear inconsistent or unpredictable. These changes are not necessarily attempts to hurt or disconnect. They are attempts to reduce stimulation and regain emotional stability. What makes this phase particularly complex is that emotional attachment does not disappear during withdrawal. In fact, the bond often still exists strongly beneath the surface. However, it becomes compartmentalized. The emotional system begins to separate desire from engagement. There is still care, still attraction, still emotional connection, but it is now managed from a distance. This creates internal contradiction, wanting closeness but needing space at the same time. During this distancing phase, the nervous system begins to recalibrate. Without constant emotional input, the sense of overwhelm decreases. Thoughts become clearer. Emotional pressure reduces. The system begins to return to a more balanced state where connection feels less threatening again. In this state, the idea of closeness may start to feel more accessible once more. This is where the cycle often becomes visible. After enough distance, emotional calm returns. And when calm returns, the emotional system no longer perceives closeness as overwhelming in the same way. The desire for connection can re-emerge. The same person who stepped back to find relief may now feel open again to engagement. Not because the underlying fear has fully disappeared, but because the emotional intensity has reset to a manageable level. However, from the outside, this cycle creates confusion. The push feels like rejection, and the pull feels like renewal. But internally, both are part of the same regulation process, one that alternates between closeness and distance in order to maintain emotional balance. The system is not consistently rejecting or consistently embracing. It is fluctuating based on perceived emotional capacity at any given moment. This is what makes the push phase so difficult to interpret. It is not a straight line of disinterest. It is a protective pause, a retreat from intensity rather than a removal of connection. And without understanding this internal process, the behavior can easily be misread as inconsistency in affection when in reality it is inconsistency in emotional tolerance. The push away, therefore, is not the end of connection. It is the system's attempt to preserve it without becoming overwhelmed by it. After distance has been created and emotional intensity begins to settle, something interesting happens inside the emotional system. The pressure that once felt overwhelming starts to fade. The nervous system is no longer in a state of activation. The urgency to pull away, the need for space, and the internal discomfort that triggered withdrawal gradually decrease. In this quieter emotional state, clarity begins to return, but it is not the same clarity that existed during closeness. It is a reset clarity, shaped by absence rather than engagement. During this phase of emotional distance, the bond does not disappear. Instead, it changes form. It moves from active emotional engagement to reflective emotional awareness. Without the constant stimulation of closeness, the emotional system is no longer overloaded. This creates room for feelings that were previously masked by intensity to resurface in a more stable way. The connection is no longer experienced as pressure. It is experienced as memory, familiarity, and emotional grounding. As this emotional calm settles in, the mind starts to reinterpret the relationship. The same connection that once felt overwhelming begins to feel more manageable. The emotional weight that triggered withdrawal is no longer present at the same level. This shift naturally creates space for curiosity again. Thoughts about the connection reappear, not from urgency, but from emotional distance that now feels safe. This is where re-engagement begins to form. It is not usually a sudden decision, but a gradual return of emotional openness. Messages that once felt draining may now feel easy again. Communication that was avoided may now feel comfortable. The emotional system is no longer in defense mode, so connection does not feel threatening in the same way. What once required withdrawal now feels like something that can be approached again. However, this return is not built on a complete resolution of the underlying emotional pattern. Instead, it is based on reduced emotional intensity. Because the original trigger, overwhelm from closeness, has temporarily disappeared, the system no longer perceives the same level of risk. This allows affection, interest, and emotional warmth to reemerge more naturally. It can feel like a fresh start, even though it is actually a return to a paused cycle. From the outside, this phase can feel hopeful and confusing at the same time. Just when emotional distance created pain or uncertainty, connection begins to reappear. This contrast creates emotional contrast bias. The return feels more meaningful because it follows absence. The emotional system responds strongly to relief after separation, making reconnection feel especially significant. Internally, re-engagement is often experienced as emotional comfort rather than emotional urgency. There is less pressure to define the relationship or sustain constant intensity. Instead, there is a sense of ease in returning to familiar emotional territory. The bond feels accessible again because it is no longer saturated with overwhelm. This is what allows communication to resume, affection to reappear, and emotional warmth to be expressed once more. But what makes this cycle complex is that the re-engagement is not always accompanied by awareness of the previous emotional overload. The memory of discomfort may be softened or distant compared to the present feeling of calm. So the system re-enters connection without fully processing the reason for the previous withdrawal. This creates a pattern where reconnection feels genuine, but is still vulnerable to repetition of the same cycle if emotional intensity rises again. This phase is often mistaken for emotional growth or resolution, but in many cases, it is simply emotional recalibration. The system has returned to a baseline where connection feels safe again. Not necessarily because the underlying dynamics have changed, but because the emotional conditions have reset. And so the cycle continues quietly. Distance restores balance, balance restores openness, and openness eventually leads back to intensity again. What makes this dynamic so emotionally draining is not just the behavior itself, but what it does to the mind of the person experiencing it. When someone is pulled close and then pushed away repeatedly, The emotional system doesn't interpret it as a neutral pattern. It interprets it as a problem to solve. The brain naturally searches for consistency, meaning, and stability in relationships. So when consistency is missing, the mind begins working overtime to create it artificially. At first, there is confusion. The inconsistency doesn't make sense, so the mind starts analyzing everything. Small details become significant. Tone changes, response time, word choices, and emotional expressions are all examined for hidden meaning. The person begins to replay conversations, trying to locate the moment where things shifted. This mental replay is not intentional. It is a natural response to emotional unpredictability. Over time, this analysis turns into emotional self-questioning. Instead of seeing inconsistency as a pattern in the other person's emotional regulation, it gets internalized as a reflection of personal value. Thoughts begin to form quietly. Did I do something wrong? Was I too much? Did I say something that caused distance? This is where emotional confusion begins to turn inward. The most damaging part is that the connection does not completely disappear. There are still moments of warmth, attention, and reconnection. These moments act like emotional relief after uncertainty. When distance feels painful, even a small return of closeness feels powerful. It creates emotional contrast. Highs feel higher because they follow lows, and lows feel deeper because they follow connection. This contrast creates a psychological loop. The emotional system begins to chase relief. Instead of letting go, it waits for the return of closeness. The mind starts to associate emotional stability with the next moment of reconnection, rather than with internal grounding. This is where emotional dependency quietly begins to form, not because of weakness, but because the system is trying to stabilize uncertainty. As the cycle continues, emotional energy becomes consumed by waiting, interpreting, and hoping. The person starts to become more focused on the unpredictable connection than on their own emotional state. Attention shifts outward. Instead of asking, "How do I feel in this relationship?" the question becomes, "What is happening with them right now?" This external focus slowly erodes emotional balance. Another layer of confusion comes from inconsistency in behavior itself. When someone alternates between closeness and distance, both signals feel real in the moment. The warmth feels genuine, and so does the withdrawal. This makes it difficult for the mind to categorize the experience clearly. It is not purely positive or purely negative, it is both, and the brain struggles more with mixed signals than with clear ones. Because of this, emotional attachment deepens not despite confusion, but because of it. The uncertainty creates mental preoccupation. The unpredictability creates emotional investment. The system starts trying harder to understand, to stabilize, to predict the next shift. But the more effort is put into understanding, the more emotionally entangled the experience becomes. Over time, this creates emotional exhaustion, not because the connection is constant, but because it is inconsistent. The emotional system is constantly switching between hope and uncertainty, connection and distance, clarity and confusion. This fluctuation drains internal stability. The most important realization in this stage is that the confusion is not random. It is a result of inconsistent emotional availability. But while the mind searches for personal explanation, the real issue lies in the pattern itself. And as long as the cycle continues, the emotional system remains caught between interpretation and anticipation, never fully grounded in stability. At a certain point in this cycle, something shifts, not in the other person, but in awareness. After enough emotional confusion, mixed signals, and internal exhaustion, a moment of clarity begins to form. It does not arrive loudly or dramatically. Instead, it arrives quietly, often after emotional fatigue reaches its peak. It is the moment where the mind stops trying to fix, explain, or decode the pattern and starts observing it as it is. This shift in awareness changes everything. For a long time, the emotional focus was outward, trying to understand behavior, predict responses, and interpret inconsistencies. But in this moment of clarity, attention begins to turn inward. The question slowly changes from "Why is this happening?" to "What is this doing to me?" That shift alone is powerful because it moves the center of gravity from confusion to self-awareness. With this awareness, the pattern becomes visible. The pull that once felt like deep connection is now seen as intermittent availability. The push that once felt like rejection is now understood as withdrawal after emotional overload. The cycle that once felt mysterious now becomes recognizable as a repeating emotional rhythm: intensity, distance, reconnection, and repeat. And once something is seen clearly, it cannot be unseen. This clarity does not always bring immediate comfort. In fact, it can feel uncomfortable at first because it removes the illusion of unpredictability being special or meaningful. What once felt like emotional depth is now understood as emotional inconsistency. What once felt like intense love is now seen as fluctuating availability. This reframe can be emotionally painful because it challenges the meaning that was attached to the connection. But this discomfort is also where emotional strength begins to rebuild, because clarity replaces guessing, and guessing is one of the most emotionally draining states a person can stay in. When there is no longer a need to decode every interaction, emotional energy starts returning to the self. The mind is no longer occupied with trying to solve someone else's emotional rhythm. With continued awareness, emotional detachment begins to form, not as coldness, but as protection. Detachment here does not mean absence of feeling. It means separation between what is felt and what is tolerated. It becomes possible to acknowledge care without allowing inconsistency to dictate emotional stability. The emotional system begins to recognize that intensity is not the same as security, and presence is not the same as consistency. This stage is where emotional boundaries naturally start to emerge, not necessarily through confrontation, but through internal decisions. Less emotional energy is invested in unpredictable responses. Less meaning is assigned to inconsistent behavior. Attention slowly shifts back toward personal grounding, emotional balance, and inner stability. And as this happens, something important becomes clear. Emotional peace does not come from finally understanding the other person. It comes from no longer needing to. The cycle loses its power when it no longer defines emotional state. The highs no longer feel like relief, and the lows no longer feel like crisis. They become recognized as parts of a pattern rather than signals of personal value. This clarity does not always end the connection, but it changes the relationship with it. It becomes possible to see the dynamic without being pulled into it. And in that space, emotional freedom begins to grow. Not because the other person changes, but because the internal need for resolution through them begins to dissolve. Ultimately, this is the real turning point, when understanding replaces confusion and awareness replaces emotional reaction. And from that place, the cycle no longer controls the emotional world in the same way. It simply becomes something that is seen, understood, and no longer unconsciously followed.